Mahaba, Nin Hao, Privyet, hello and welcome to See in Red. Today we're going to be looking at the history of the Labour Party, specifically the myth of Old Labour. Since the election of Jeremy Corbyn to the position of leader of the Labour Party in 2015, there have been a lot of mentions in the media of Old Labour as something different to the pro-imperialistic, anti-working class party of the recent Blairite years. Figures like Keir Hardie and Clement Attlee are held up as shining examples of British socialists, while Tony Blair is blamed for turning the party away from socialism and into a party of imperialism. But isn't Old Labour guilty of many of the same crimes that New Labour is guilty of? Let's have a look at these characters and see if this narrative really does hold up to scrutiny. The Labour Party was founded on the 27th February 1900 from members of the Independent Labour Party, Fabian Society, Social Democratic Federation and Scottish Labour. Keir Hardie was one of the first leaders of the Labour Party, having been previously a driving force behind the Independent Labour Party, the ILP. Before the formation of the ILP, the privileged worker had always entered politics on a Liberal ticket, but the defeat of the Manningham Mills cotton strike in 1891 by the Liberal government forced the trade unions into an organisational split with the Liberal Party. An organisational split, but not a political one. During the founding congress of the ILP, the inclusion of the word socialist in the party name was rejected in an effort to appeal to the liberal Labour aristocracy who had been building their stake in capitalism since the mid-1800s. A prominent couple in the Labour Party at the time was Beatrice and Sidney Webb, both middle-class socialists of the Fabian Society, with the latter being the person who wrote the original text for Clause 4, which we'll get to later. The Fabian Society had proved itself to be highly influential on the Labour Party, in attracting other middle-class socialists who shared their disdain for the working class and their rejection of class conflict into the party. The Labour Party was not going to be a party of the international socialist movement, rather it was going to be a party to control and tame the unskilled proletariat and move them away from any revolutionary thought. Beatrice Webb herself once wrote, "Judging from our knowledge of the Labour movement, we can expect no leaders from the working class. Our only hope is permeating a young middle-class man." The imperialist and racist tones of the Labour Party was summed up by Sidney Webb in 1901 when he stated, "What is the use of an empire if it does not breed and maintain in the truest and fullest sense of the word an imperial race?" The Labour Party was doing its best to present itself as a party of middle-class radical liberals that could be trusted to maintain British imperialism. Ramsay MacDonald proclaimed in a series of pamphlets, "So far as the underlying spirit of imperialism is a frank acceptance of national duty, exercised beyond the nation's political frontier, it cannot be condemned. The compulsion to expand and assume world responsibility is worthy at origin." Ramsay MacDonald would later go on to win the 1923 general election, with the help, of course, of the Liberal Party, and form the first Labour government, largely in part due to the Conservative Party's diplomatic failure in Europe, Middle East and Asia in the years following World War I. MacDonald's first term was extremely polarising. While it is often claimed that the capitalist class was, for the most part, happy with MacDonald's leadership of the government, the socialist movement, on the other hand, felt bitterly disappointed and betrayed by MacDonald's liberal leadership of the Labour Party. The party had promised socialism, but the first Labour government made it clear they only wanted a more manageable capitalism. He denounced capitalism, only then to embrace it. From his rejection of class conflicts in favour of a middle-class dominance of the Labour movement, he even went as far to claim that socialism is not workers' control of the means of production, but a mutual agreement, an understanding between the working class and the capitalist class, an agreement that sees the capitalist class regain full control of the means of production. For socialism is not fully explained as a result of labour against capitalism. It is a conception of a society in which the antagonisms from which that revolt arises are harmonised. Did socialism only mean to put labour in power so that cramped working class interests could pursue the same self-regarding policies as capitalist interests pursued? Stormy indeed would be this prospect. It is true that in the conflicts which divide the working man from his employer in present-day society, socialism has to take sides with the forces that are making for a new society. But it is above the conflicts in spirit, and it is steadily infused in both sides, the creative desire to get beyond present divides and reach a state in which all services will be done for communal ends by men who feel the community in their hearts, and know that its wealth means their own wealth. Therefore, socialism can only move men by education and moral idealism. Its sound economic criticisms of the classes must be used as logs by which the fire of moral enthusiasm are kept blazing. It takes no part in a purely horizontal tug-of-war between the working class and the capitalist class, but is plutonic force beneath both, heaving them upwards. The seemingly intentional misunderstanding of the goals of socialism were oddly enough picked up by the wrecker Leon Trotsky, who stated, "MacDonald knows nothing about socialism. Absolutely nothing." Nevertheless, MacDonald's reputation had been well earned. The idealist, the pacifist, the non-socialist, the liberal. MacDonald was brought down by a vote of no confidence due to an article in the Communist Party newspaper, Workers' Weekly, which led the House of Lords to believe that the labour movement, which MacDonald had been trusted to pacify, was calling for mutiny. The article in question, titled "An Open Letter to Fighting Forces," read, "Comrades, you never joined the army or navy because you were in love with warfare or because you were attracted to the glamour of the uniform. In 9 cases out of 10 you were compelled to join the services after a long fight against poverty and misery caused by prolonged unemployment. Repressive regulations and irksome restrictions are intentionally imposed upon you, and when war is declared, you are supposed to be filled with a longing to beat the enemy. The enemy consists of working men like yourselves, living under the same slave conditions. Soldiers, sailors, airmen, flesh of our flesh and bone of our bone. The Communist Party calls upon you to begin the task of not only organising passive resistance when war is declared, or when an industrial dispute involves you, but to definitely and categorically let it be known that neither in the class war nor a military war will you turn your guns on your fellow workers, but instead will line up with your fellow workers in an attack upon the exploiters and capitalists. We will use your arms on the side of your own class. Refuse to shoot down your fellow workers. Refuse to fight for profit. Turn your weapons on your oppressors." The perceived red threat, along with Labour backbenchers blocking MacDonald's attempt to indict the editor of the communist publication, was enough to push through the vote of no confidence, forcing MacDonald to resign in disgrace after only 9 months in power. A general election was called, and Labour was defeated by the Conservative Stanley Baldwin. But then in 1929, giving weight to Einstein's definition of insanity of doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result, MacDonald was elected Prime Minister for a second time, with the support yet again by the Liberal Party being his ideological crutch. MacDonald had managed to maintain control of his support of the Labour aristocracy and the capitalist class. But before the dust of the election had chanced to settle, along came the worst crisis of capitalism yet. On October 29th, 1929, a day that would be remembered in history as Black Tuesday, came the news that the US stock market had collapsed, causing a decline in commodity prices and an increase in interest rates. As the US had already carved out its position as the nerve centre of global capitalism, this caused capitalist economies worldwide to plummet. MacDonald had not seen this coming. Having refused to heed the warning of the socialist movement that he had placed himself in the forefront of, that crisis in capitalism is inevitable and will get increasingly severe until the contradictions between labour and capital reach breaking point. Faced with this Great Depression, MacDonald and his Labour Party thought it was more important to balance the books than to feed and house the poor, throwing an already impoverished working class further into turmoil. Facing pressures from his Liberal puppet masters, and in spite of opposition from the trade unions, Labour cut the wages of the public sector and slashed public spending, mainly targeting the unemployed. MacDonald was also facing a serious threat to British imperialism abroad, as the Indian National Congress was demanding independence from British rule. The independence movement was gaining momentum, and Gandhi's call for non-cooperation was being increasingly interpreted by the peasants as non-payment of rent and tax. All over the country, people were asserting themselves in the face of British imperialism, but the Labour Party had been trusted to protect the empire, and their response would be brutal and severe. In the city of Solapa, communists led a successful rebellion against the British rulers, and they managed to kick them out for a week, declaring the city a commune. A shoot-to-kill order was issued, and martial law was declared by the military. The National Congress had been banned, and scores of revolutionary leaders had been rounded up and hung. For the next 10 months, the government would double down on its attacks against the Indian people, with public beatings, crowds being fired upon, and even RAF bombers being used to disperse crowds. Up to 90,000 people were arrested, and countless people were killed. In January 1931, the Labour Party called a conference between the representatives of the 3 British parties, wealthy Indian industrialists, landowners, as well as future puppets from the Indian princely states. MacDonald told the conference, "I pray that by our labour, India will possess the pride and honour of responsible self-government." The mere suggestion of self-governance was enough for Gandhi to return to the National Congress and push for an amnesty. although he agreed to the British terms to exclude any revolutionary group, many of which were then hung shortly after. By this point, there was the huge divides with the Labour Party back home. Figures such as Arthur Henderson were coming out in opposition against MacDonald's government. Feeling that he could no longer lead a divided party, MacDonald submitted his resignation, but was met with a counter-offer by King George. MacDonald was to form and lead a new national government made up of a coalition between the Conservatives and the Liberal Party. In response to this, MacDonald was expelled from the Labour Party, and Arthur Henderson became the new party leader. So, MacDonald forms his own party, the National Labour Organisation, made up mainly of MacDonald's exiled MPs. The Labour Party was in chaos, and MacDonald was labelled as a traitor to the party that he led and the movement that he was elected to represent. The Conservatives pushed MacDonald for an election in October 1931. The national government won with the largest share going to the Conservatives. The Labour Party was mostly wiped out. The first Labour Prime Minister had thrown his party to the wolves, while he was now leading a party of Tories and Liberals. During MacDonald's next few years, while he enjoyed his largest mandate of his career, thanks to his alliance with the Tories, he resided over the partition of India and also helped facilitate Nazi Germany's return to the concert of European powers. His popularity had hit the lowest it had ever been, whereas once his alleged pacifism was admired, now it was seen as a weakness in the face of an ever-growing threat from Nazi Germany. MacDonald was retired in 1935 due to his failing mental health and physical health. 2 years later he was dead, a traitor to the working class to the end. It's 1945 and Europe is in ruins. Hitler is dead, the Red Army is in Berlin, and Britain is just shy of £4 billion worth of external debt, equaling 40% of its national GDP, and the United States has chosen now is the time to assert its dominance over Britain by terminating a very favourable lend-lease between the two nations. The only solution being is to take out another loan with America, worth an additional $3.75 billion, along with a condition that all pound sterling owners would be able to freely convert their pound sterlings into dollars. The Americans were now directly threatening Britain's financial control over the empire, and this was a big worry to the British capitalists. If they don't have financial control over the colonial empire, then that means that the post-war construction of Britain would need to be paid for by the own British working class. So to counter this, the resources from the colonies would need to be ruthlessly plundered like never before. Thanks to the Soviet Union's heroic efforts in smashing Hitler's war machine and destroying fascism in Europe, communism had now spread to all corners of the world, and more colonial and semi-colonial nations were having their own national liberation movements in China, Malaya, Greece, Yugoslavia, Vietnam, and all led by communists. While the socialist bloc was getting larger and stronger, the imperialist camp was weak, and out of all the surviving imperialist powers, Britain was the weakest. The threat of working class revolution in Britain for the first time was a real prospect, and it was something that the capitalist class would do anything to prevent. So it is with this context that we introduce our second Labour Prime Minister, Clement Attlee, a man who is often credited as being the greatest Prime Minister of the UK, closely followed by Margaret Thatcher. I don't understand that either. Attlee was a rare catch in that he was one of only 2 Labour MPs who actually had any experience of government, as the rest of the MPs were all wiped out by MacDonald. During the Second World War, Attlee pulled the Labour Party into Churchill's wartime coalition, making Attlee the first UK Deputy Prime Minister. But despite Churchill being painted as a national hero for keeping the Nazis off British shores during the war, Labour managed to win the election afterwards on a platform of promise of social reform. The capitalist class wasn't really worried by this victory, quite the opposite, as they understood the public was becoming increasingly dissatisfied by the capitalist system and were growing weary of the continuous wars that capitalism brought. And so was needed the gentle face of Labour to steer the working class away from the ideas of revolution as they had previously done. The immediate issue for Labour was to prevent the spread of revolution in Southeast Asia, the Middle East and Europe, where resistance to the empire's policies of plunder were gaining mass support. 40,000 British troops had already been sent to Greece and ordered the Greek Liberation Forces, the EAM, to give up their arms, despite having overwhelming popular support, so that a liberal puppet government could be installed instead. Under the direction of Labour, the new Greek government carried out a clampdown on all trade union activity. In response to these brutal tactics used by the government, EAM called for a general strike. Labour wasted no time in deploying the British Army to Athens, and by December 1945, hundreds of EAM supporters had been murdered and 50,000 had been imprisoned. In Vietnam, a week after 1 million people gathered in Hanoi to hear Ho Chi Minh read the Declaration of Independence for the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, 20,000 soldiers of the Indian British Army arrived in Saigon with the intention of rearming the defeated Japanese army, with the intention of removing the communists from the south of the country and restoring French rule. In response, the general strike was called. The British Army issued a threat of summary execution for anybody taking part in the demonstrations or speaking out against the occupation. Clement Attlee stated, "The government is carrying out the principles for which it has always stood," and indeed it was. Shortly after, French colonial forces, with the support of the British Army, carried out a coup, taking control of the government of South Vietnam. The Labour Party's actions caused a conflict in Vietnam that would last 30 years and caused the death of millions of people. The plunder of resource was particularly extreme in Malaya, where Britain controlled 45% of the world's natural rubber and 30% of the world's tin. Between 1939 and 1949, wages for workers fell by 80%, while the owners announced record profits. The trade union movement was organising mass demonstrations to protest against the conditions. The Labour government took no time in blaming the workers for these strikes and began brutally cracking down on the demonstrations, with strikes being regularly shot upon by police and plantation workers being beaten to death for refusing to go back to work. In May 1949, the Labour Party banned the Federation of Trade Unions in Malaya and hanged their president and vice president. In response to the destruction of the trade unions, the Communist Party of Malaya saw no other option than to resort to armed struggle to defend the working class. The Labour Party again had started a 12-year conflict that saw trade unionists and communists being thrown into concentration camps and beheaded by British soldiers. The Labour Party was showing that there was no depths that it would not sink to preserve British imperialism. Knowing that they couldn't resort to the same violent tactics at home that they'd been using abroad, the Labour Party decided to offer the British public a concession, in that it would receive a national health service that would follow in a similar vein to the Soviet model that had been in place since 1936. And so, on the 5th of July 1949, healthcare in Britain would be free from the point of use. This is usually cited the reason why Clement Attlee ranks number one as British Prime Minister. Obviously, you just have to ignore the brutal fashion in which she acquired these funds in the first place. Okay, so before we move on, let's just have a few words of Clause 4. I know we have ignored it to this point, but so have the Labour Party, so I thought we could get away with it. Yeah, so Clause 4 was a part of the Labour Party constitution that was added in 1918. Despite it deliberately not saying so, Part 4 of Clause 4 is widely upheld as an example of the Labour Party's commitment to socialism, the text of which reads, "To secure for the workers, by hand or by brain, the full fruits of their industry and the most equitable distribution thereof, that may be possible upon the basis of common ownership of the means of production, distribution and exchange, and at the best obtainable system of popular administration and control of each industry or service." In 1995, Tony Blair had the text changed to, "The Labour Party is a democratic socialist party. It believes that by strength of our common endeavour we achieve more than we achieve alone, so as to create for each of us the means to realise our true potential, and for all of us a community in which power, wealth and opportunity are in hands of many, not the few, where the rights we enjoy reflect the duties we owe, and where we live together freely in spirit of solidarity, tolerance and respect." This change was widely seen by the left wing of the Labour Party, as Blair trying to distance himself from any perceived commitment to socialism in exchange of a neoliberal social democratic platform. When Tony Blair came to power in 1997, the UK had been under Conservative rule since 1979, inflicting Thatcherism on the British working class for 18 years, bringing with it widespread privatisation, war and deindustrialisation. Tony Blair promised under New Labour things could only get better.
Light them all up. Come on, fire.
It didn't take long for things to start getting worse. Labour wasted no time in showcasing its commitment to global capitalism and British imperialism, through massive cuts to public spending that totalled £40 billion in the first 3 years alone, added to the City of London being given direct control of Bank of England's interest rates, showed that British ruling class and their investment was safe under this alleged socialist party. Britain was boasting its lowest corporate tax levels ever, while Labour further attacked the working class by slashing benefits for those in need, forcing the unemployed into low-paid jobs. None of the Conservatives' previous anti-trade union legislation was contested. It seemed that the Tories had found their man in Tony Blair. In fact, when Margaret Thatcher was asked what was her greatest achievement, she said, Tony Blair and New Labour. It didn't take long for Labour to start banging the war drums either. In 1998, Labour committed forces to a peacetime bombing against Iraq, alongside of American air forces, in which schools, hospitals and homes were destroyed, causing the deaths of 200 Iraqi civilians. The following year, Labour, under the command of NATO, carried out massive attacks against Yugoslavia. For 2 months, the country's industry infrastructure was systematically destroyed by cruise missiles, carpet bombing, cluster bombs and depleted uranium weapons. Railways, buses, hospitals, markets, schools, libraries, theatres, museums, churches were all destroyed, with rivers and water supplies being polluted with fatal toxins. The attack caused the death of thousands of people and caused thousands more to become refugees, in what Labour would describe as collateral damage. Tony Blair promised to NATO, "We will redouble and intensify our campaign. We will carry on pounding day after day." And anyone who opposed Labour's war was labelled as a fascist sympathiser. In Northern Ireland, Blair had managed to manipulate the so-called peace process and demand greater concessions from the Republican movement. The IRA was to be disbanded, and Sinn Féin was forced into accepting British policing in Northern Ireland. Any Republican prisoner who refused to accept British rule was kept in prison. After the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, Labour became the attack dog for the United States. Within a week, 20 Royal Navy vessels had been readied to aid in the invasion of Afghanistan, while Blair went on a world tour to gather support for George Bush's war on terror. Between October 2001 and April 2002, over 22,000 bombs were dropped in Afghanistan, killing an estimated 8,000 civilians and causing a further 20,000 to die from starvation and cold. Blair refused to allow any break in the bombing to allow humanitarian aid to be delivered. Once the invasion of Afghanistan was underway, Labour passed a new policy on the use of torture. While British agents could not be seen to condone torture, these new rules would allow prisoners to be exported from British custody to Pakistan, Egypt and United Arab Emirates to be tortured there. And despite having absolutely nothing to do with the 9/11 attacks and having no links with the Saudi terror groups who committed the attack, the Labour Party committed the British Army to an illegal joint US-UK invasion of Iraq, under the pretext of destroying Saddam Hussein's non-existent weapons of mass destruction. Labour repeated what it knew to be a lie 1,000 times all over the world and at home. Despite Iraq fully cooperating with UN weapons inspectors, Labour and its American partners had no intention of taking any other path than the one that led in the total destruction of Iraq. On the 19th of March 2003, Blair and Bush launched their invasion of Iraq. An estimated 1 million Iraqis lost their lives as a result of Labour's illegal war. Iraqi cities were destroyed and the nation was thrown into a continuous sectarian violence. And out of the chaos of Iraq, countless terror groups were able to grow, including Daesh, who have brought terrorism to every corner of the globe. New Labour would also continue in the footsteps of the Labour of old, in showing nothing but support to the Zionist regime and its policy of terrorism against the people of Palestine. When Palestinian demonstrators were being murdered by Israeli soldiers during the Palestinian Intifada in 2000, Labour refused to condemn it. When Lebanon called for a ceasefire to Israeli bombing of their country in 2006, Labour not only refused their calls for peace, but used it as a chance to blame Iran and Syria for aiding Lebanon in their defence against Israel. In June 2007, following the failures of the Fatah-led coup against the democratically elected Hamas government, Labour gave its full support to the Israeli blockade of Gaza. At home, Labour's new anti-terror legislation was being used to arrest anybody whose beliefs could be categorised as terrorist, by simply criticising the UK's foreign policy or speaking out against Western imperialism. Groups such as the Kurdish Workers' Party, the Turkish Communist Party, Hezbollah and Hamas were all added to the UK's terrorist watch list. In 2009 alone, there was 150,000 stop and searches, overwhelmingly against the Muslim community, with a rate of 1 to 1,000 of those actually being charged under the Terrorism Act. Again, all this goes to show the racist undertones that the Labour Party have always had in carrying out these imperialistic policies abroad. So, despite the more recent neoliberal economic model that has been adapted, there doesn't seem to be much of a difference between New Labour and Old Labour. The split seems to only be in the mind of people who want to remember the Labour Party as something different to what it actually was. So, the question seems to be, why does the Labour movement, specifically the socialist movement, repeatedly keep throwing their cards in with a party that has shown itself to be nothing but a champion of imperialism all over the world? Labour has done everything it can to silence any voice of dissent and destroy or pervert any attempt to form a real socialist movement in Britain. Now, it's been said Jeremy Corbyn is a man of principle and a true socialist. If this is true, then I say he is in the wrong party. To paraphrase Lenin, socialists should support Labour in the same way that a rope supports a hanged man. The Labour Party are not socialists, they are social democrats, and social democrats always betray.
I will point a gun for my country, but I won't guarantee you which way.